Back in the 17th century, those who ruled the sea ruled the world. Pirate captains had to walk the tightrope between harsh and just to keep their crew from conspiring against them, so their punishments for devious crew members had to be savage. Just how horrifying were these bloody pirate punishments? Let's find out with Newfound History. Without strict discipline, a pirate crew could quickly devolve into chaos and mutiny, putting everyone on board at risk. After all, where could they escape to if they were stranded in the middle of the sea? Captains resorted to tortures and humiliating ceremonies to ensure loyalty through fear, and each transgression had its matching set of punishments. For those who stole from the ship's provision, they could expect a painful flogging session. Flogging was usually dished out by the ship's quartermaster, who would employ the so-called cat-o'-nine-tails, a special whip made up of 9 lengths of rope. Each of these was roughly 1/4 of an inch thick and around 2 feet long. This was worse, far worse than traditional whips. The sailor often bit on a bullet to muffle their agony, but even then it was difficult. The lacerating tails were enough to make anyone scream in pain. And if they did, rest assured their crewmates would remind them of their humiliation as much as they could, using mocking names such as Nightingale, an insult used for those who lacked guts and courage. Flogging also served as a punishment for pirates who brought women on board, struck another man, or didn't keep weapons ready when the time came for action. But flogging was a relatively light punishment when compared to clapping in irons. This involved placing a pirate in a set of heavy iron restraints, usually on their wrists or ankles, and confining them to a small, cramped space on the ship, such as the brig or a small room below deck. Other times, these pirates would be left in a dark corner in the middle of a storm without food or water nearby. The violent shaking of the ship in high seas was enough to throw them around, breaking their bound ankles and wrists. It was also seen as a warning to other crew members, as seeing a fellow pirate bloody and bruised from the clapping irons caused fear and phantom pain. Yet pirate captains weren't the only sadistic members of the ship, as other crew members devised torture games to entertain themselves with their unfortunate captives. One of these was the blooding and sweating game, where they'd make a captive run between a line of sailors who'd stab them with cutlasses, daggers, and even sail needles as they passed. Other crew members would play the fiddle and cheer. As for their victims, pirates were known to kill them without hesitation, often for no reason other than relieving their boredom while at sea. They would board ships, kill the crew, and then plunder the cargo. Most of the time, they'd torture the crew members because many captains thought captured crews were hiding valuables on board and didn't want to reveal them. The most common were being beaten, whipped, cut, or even putting lit matches between their fingers. Other times, they'd spare the crew members, but the outcome wasn't good for them either. They'd capture them and force them into slavery, where they'd perform hard labor indefinitely. Now, rising up in the tiers of torture was another sadistic game, that of leaving their victims on a deserted island. This was known as marooning. Pirates would maroon unwanted captives or crew members when supplies ran tight. If they were marooned, they'd be given a keg of water or rum, a pistol, and gunpowder at best. Many times they'd be stripped down naked. Thirst and starvation were their most likely fate, so these mariners usually asked to be shot straight away, or if they were given the pistol, they would at least be able to take their own life before the starvation did. Or would they? This didn't always happen. Captain Edward England and part of his crew were marooned on an island in the Indian Ocean in 1720, and they miraculously escaped by building a boat, sailing to Madagascar, and finding their way to civilization there. If the ship had captured too many people, like slaves, and they couldn't safely maroon all of them, they'd just straight up throw them overboard. Among the worst cases of this in history was during the Zong Massacre, where 130 slaves had been thrown overboard off a British ship once their food and water supplies ran low. Yet what about one of the most famous pirate punishments? Contrary to what Pirates of the Caribbean or animated shows might have you believe, walking the plank was very rare for pirates. However, rest assured that it was a gruesome death when it happened. The victim was tied to weights and was forced to walk off the end of the plank into the sea. Sources claim that the pirate Stede Bonnet, who was hanged in 1718, invented the walking the plank punishment to entertain his crew. Apparently, it was reserved for mariners who were suspected of being drunk all the time. An infamous pirate known as Black Bart, who you'll learn more about later, stipulated what was known as the Pirate Code, where if a pirate was caught stealing from a matey, their nose and ears would be slit and they'd maroon them. If the pirate was accused of more serious crimes, such as desertion or plotting a mutiny, then they'd be dried out in the sun. This involved strapping the pirate to the mast or another exposed part of the ship and leaving them to bake in the sun for hours or even days without food or water. Imagine the hot, relentless, and humid Caribbean climate. Most of the time, this led to dehydration, sunstroke, and even death. To make matters worse, some victims were nailed to poles at the tide line, where if the sun didn't claim them first, the tide or the shore creatures would. But anyways, there's another pirate torture known historically as one of the bloodiest punishments in history. We're talking about keel hauling. This form of torture involves the keel, which is the bottom backbone of the ship. It was so bad that the fear of being keel hauled was enough to keep most crew members under control by the ship's captain. The sailor would be stripped and tied to chains, sometimes with cannonballs at their feet, then dragged across the keel from bow to stern. The sailor could drown, but most likely they'd be ripped to pieces from the close contact with the barnacles. Often they lost limbs or even their head. And that's not the end. Victims of keel hauling would be left hanging on the yardarm to warn other sailors not to try anything funny. To top it all off, if the victim miraculously survived, the captain would have him keel hauled again. Keel hauling was used as early as 700 BCE until the mid-19th century. So who were the pirates who used this? One of the worst English pirates in history was Charles Vane. He had mariners beaten, cut, and hanged, with a particular victim being tied to the ship's bowsprit and tortured with burning matches. Vane was hanged in 1721. Much worse than Vane was the Welsh pirate Bartholomew Roberts. Remember the Black Bart we mentioned? He had captured a group of Dutchmen and had their ears cut off, hanged, and their bodies used for target practice. He even had the governor of Martinique hanged. Yep, we can easily conclude that pirates love a good hanging session after capturing ships. But the worst of the worst was Edward Lowe, an Englishman who haunted the Caribbean and Eastern Atlantic from 1721 to 1724. In just 3 years, he racked up a list of crimes that made the other captains we mentioned look like saints. He cut up and hanged some Portuguese passengers, including 2 friars, and had the lips of another Portuguese captain cut off and burned in front of him. He tied a French cook to the mast of his vessel, set it on fire, and captured a fisherman from Nantucket to cut off his ears and shoot him dead. Another fisherman was made to eat his own ears and even had his men cut the heart out of another captain from Rhode Island and feed it to another prisoner. With all that seaborne crime, who was there to stop it? With pirates being free to dispense that level of brutality to anyone they disliked, the European empires had to take action or else their reputation be diminished. Plus, pirates kept pillaging and burning their cargo ships and making off with the treasure they stole from the colonies. The British Admiralty was the first to give the East India Company the power to pursue, try, and hang pirates. Early during the Golden Age, some pirates would receive a pardon if they were only minor crew members or of a young age, but piracy became so brutal that at the minimum they'd risk imprisonment unless they could convince the court that they were unwilling members of the pirate crew. Just as pirates made examples of their crew, European empires made examples of pirates by hanging them. The Golden Age of piracy lasted from 1690 through 1730. What do you think of these savage punishments? And which infamous pirate do you think was the worst of all time? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching this episode of Newfound History.